Welcome to the Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad. Today we're going to visit Andrew Dodge's On3 recreation of the railroad in the fall of 1882, and he will discuss his history and approach to modeling the line. The modeled area of the layout begins in the Platte Canyon, in the area of the Deansbury Hotel, and then proceeds to Deer Creek Tank, then to Webster at the foot of Kenosha Pass, and then to Kenosha. We will visit Como and the line's facilities there, where our train picks up a helper for the trip to Boris Pass. After cutting off the helper, our train proceeds to Breckenridge. To conclude our visit, we will follow a mix back to Como and then a passenger train headed for Denver. Let's listen as Andy describes his long love affair with Colorado narrow gauge. Andy, you have quite a history with the Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad, which goes back before the railroad we're currently looking at. Can you tell us about it?
My introduction to the Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad came Sunday morning, just the day after I came back from boarding school in 1960. And when I got up in the morning, I went into my parents' bedroom and found a copy of the pictorial supplement on the sofa. And I had already fallen in love with the railroad before breakfast was served. And I spent the rest of the day and weeks afterwards going through all the pictures, looking at all the text that I could read, and was just absolutely in love with the railroad. I spent weeks, months, years dreaming, drawing plans, youthful exuberance, not in any touch with reality, and just had a lot of fun with this. My modeling skills were not particularly good in the 1960s, and the issue of growing up, I entered my teenage years with all that is involved, and so it never really went anywhere as far as a real railroad is concerned. In the late 60s, I began to get back into model railroading, and because there was no South Park equipment available, basically, other than one type of Mason bogie, I went off with the Rio Grande narrow gauge and had fun with that for a number of years. But after starting, I was able to get a Balboa HON3 Mason bogie and had a lot of fun with that. But of course, this was an 1880s engine, and I was running with Rio Grande stuff in the 1930s, and the two didn't really match very well. So the bogie was sort of put off to the side and didn't get run very well. By the mid-1980s, I was moving to Germany, and the railroad had become somewhat abandoned. I had been very discontented with the quality, the lack of workmanship, a whole number of issues with the Rio Grande Railroad. And I had come to the conclusion either I was going to tear the whole thing out and rebuild another Rio Grande layout with all the consequences of actually including mistakes back into it again, or just making a clean break and going to something else. Oak scale always interests me as growing up and looking at magazines of oak scale engines, and I was delighted when I found Overland had made a copy of the Mason bogies in ON3. Upon my return, I quickly bought 3 of the locomotives, and I began to build my own layout in ON3 in 1988, and it lasted until 2012. I modeled the thing in the prototype, which is combined both my love of history, American history, and railroading.
So Andy, you've been with the narrow gauge and interested in the narrow gauge for a long time. Can you tell us a little bit about your interest in Colorado narrow gauge?
In the 1950s, the family took a lot of trips out west, and our first really big trip was in 1953. And as part of that trip, went to Durango, Colorado, and my father spent all morning trying to get tickets for us to take the train to Silverton. And finally, we were able to wrangle tickets to where I sat on a load of 2x4s in the baggage car when this was still a mixed train, and went up to Silverton. And since there were no assigned seats, first come, first served on the way back. And the train had 2 cabooses attached to the end of the train, and so we immediately claimed one of the cupolas and rode back on that. And I have been hooked on Colorado narrow gauge ever since. I've since made many other trips out to the Colorado narrow gauge, and actually had the fortune to see the last pure revenue run in late 1967 on the Rio Grande. All the trips out there involved research, looking at plant life, the railroads, the equipment, collecting natural materials for the layout. One of the questions people always ask is, why people use narrow gauge, or why would the interest in narrow gauge? And one of the reasons I look at it as more personable because it's smaller. I saw this as a child and sort of grew up with it, and it was much more interesting seeing, a K-28 as opposed to a big boy, which I saw run. But it's more of a manageable size. It doesn't overwhelm you. The scenery that narrow gauge used was absolutely delightful because of the sharper curves that they could build, and it could go through more spectacular scenery as opposed to just cutting through it. Another reason why narrow gauge, you get shorter trains, and what the interest I have in that is, of course, they would fit more appropriately in the basement environment because they're shorter, smaller, and are more transferable into the basement. This is another benefit. Since I have modeled in 19th century railroading, I enjoy the same benefits from that part of it. I have always been fascinated with late 19th century American history, but the real cue came for me was the Mason bogies. Now, these are engines made by the Mason Works in Massachusetts, and the boiler, cab, and tender bunker are all one solid unit, where the tender has its own truck, a 3-axle truck that swivels under that, and the drivetrain, the driver, cylinders, front truck, pilot, swivel under the boiler. And this has always fascinated me, and the articulated of the engine was just absolutely beautiful. And I've tried to build these or look at these things for many, many decades, and then finally I was able to actually bring my dream to fruition.
Most railroads went through several corporate existences during their lifetime. I assume that the South Park was no different.
The Denver South Park Pacific has a long and rather convoluted history. Historically, the railroad begins in the late 1870s. Some of the track work begins, the purchase of a lot of locomotives began, and the narrow gauge portion lasted until August of 1943, when the last part of the railroad between Leadville and Climax, the molybdenum mine that was supplying raw materials for the war effort, was finally standard gauged. Under the name of the owners of the railroad, it began with a lot of the Colorado politicians and was named after the geographical locations. But by the early 1880s, the Union Pacific took charge of the railroad. And it's interesting, it was one of the first railroads in the United States to actually employ Westinghouse air brakes because of the grades. By the end of the decade, in about 1890 or so, the railroad changed its name to the Denver, Leadville, and Gunnison. And this lasted until basically just before the turn of the century. And then it becomes under the name of the Colorado Southern, and is an independent line until 1907, when the Colorado Southern becomes under the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, and that lasts until the final abandonment of the narrow gauge in 43. And the standard gauge line is left from Leadville to Climax, remained under the Burlington flag until that line was abandoned. One of the interesting things on the name of the railroad, you look at it and say, what are these places? Well, Denver sort of speaks for itself. The South Park is a huge caldera valley depression in the mountain range southwest of Denver that's many, many miles across. And it's rather flat inside. It's atypical of most narrow gauge. But as most railroads in that time period, they always loved to stick the name Pacific on the end of it to give delusions of grandeur that they were going to be jumping off to the Pacific coast and picking up transcontinental traffic. However, this virtually never happened, and of course it did not happen with the South Park, and the railroad basically ended just north of Gunnison, Colorado. Now, one of the advantages of building a narrow gauge, of course, is the cost. It's narrower track, narrower roadbed, sharper curves, less trestles, less tunnels. It wasn't until 1883 that standard gauge became standard throughout the United States when they went to 4 foot 8.5 scale. Before that, you had B&O was 4 foot 8.5, the Pennsy was 4.9, others were 4.10, and a lot of the southern railroads were 5 foot. And this was not a particularly a problem at the time. The labor was cheap enough to change cargo from car to car, but as you move through the century, labor became more expensive. Also, railroads, like a lot of the narrow gauge lines, wanted to be proprietary. They did not want to share their equipment, their traffic, or revenues with other railroads, and this is a way to keep competition out. Unfortunately, because of this, a lot of these railroads would die because there was enough traffic to sustain the operations.
So your experiences as a child and all of your research steeped you well into Colorado narrow gauge. So now you're going to build a layout. What did you want to accomplish with your layout?
Fortunately, when I started to build the layout, I had a room of about 1,000 square feet. It was 2 rooms and another area for staging, which allowed a fair amount of latitude of what I could build. When it came down to actually what to do, was the designing phase, and I've always found this to be very interesting and crucial for a successful layout is the design. What you want to include, what will fit, can be best displayed. And I had chosen to model the South Park in the year of 1882, and I wanted to do something towards the fall. I wanted to show the railroad in its early days, not the typical narrow gauge in its last days in decline. I wanted to include on the locomotives a particular kind of smokestack, the variety they use to stop sparks from coming out of the engines and starting forest fires. And the first stacks appeared on the engines were called Nesmus, which I just found absolutely fascinating and wanted to make sure I had those. I wanted to show the railroad pre-Westinghouse air brakes and when they're using vacuum brakes, which includes some operational issues when you actually ran the railroad. And I wanted something that showed construction. I didn't want the railroad to look finished. I wanted to look like a viable thing that was actually being built at the time. The selected areas I wanted to portray, a lot of people pick areas, and I wanted to have a variety of places to show the diversity of what Colorado railroading actually included. In my wish list, I wanted a canyon. And that included, I could do that with modeling the Platte Canyon, which is southwest of Denver. And when I was doing this, I decided I was going to have part of the canyon, the railroad down in both sides of the canyon portrayed where the track is well down in the scenery and difficult to actually see, and give you the sense of isolation you'd have on that part of the railroad. Como, which was a division point of the line, is in the South Park and is a flat basin area scenery, quite atypical of what you think of narrow gauge railroading, but what a lot of narrow gauge railroading goes through is relatively flat country in areas. I wanted a Continental Divide, which gave me Boreas Pass, where I could have a beautiful stone engine house to pass for turning helpers. And I also wanted a town. The town of Como would not fit on the layout, but I could do Breckenridge. And the advantage of the Breckenridge was I could see from both sides, front and back, from one street scene. And it also gave me the end of track, because in the end of 1882, the South Park had only reached just past the town of Breckenridge and to Gunnison. And if I did the end of track at Breckenridge, then I would have a place to logically turn the train. The end of track added an additional aspect to the model railroad, in the fact that I could have construction trains and actually show something being built. One of the major areas I chose not to model, what is known as the Palisades, which is on the west side of the Continental Divide at Alpine Tunnel. And one of the reasons I decided for that was the lack of traffic density. The area is fairly sparse, and the main traffic would be some boxcars for the mining companies and also for the movement of coal cars in the 20th century. And this, while spectacular in scenery, did not particularly enthuse me as far as actually having an operating layout. So those were some of the considerations I wanted, different types of scenery and a density of operation that would provide entertaining to crews that would operate the layout.
One of the advantages of modeling the narrow gauge is that you don't need as many locomotives and cars and other equipment as you would if you were modeling mainline, contemporary, standard gauge railroading. So how much equipment did you have on your version of the South Park?
One of the advantages of modeling narrow gauge is the fact that you don't have to have much equipment and rolling stock or locomotives. But on the downside, you can't walk into the hobby store and just buy this stuff and put it on your layout. So there is a charm to this. It does not make it as easy as it sounds. I had about 45 pieces of rolling stock in On3 for the layout. A lot of this was all scratch built, according to plans by Ron Rutnick, who was working for the Denver South Park Historical Group, and had put a lot of records together from printed records and photographs. I had 7 passenger cars. 3 of them were Bachmann, which required a rebuilding of the end platforms and the roofs to do the duckbill. The others were scratch built, some of them all the way from from total scratch. No, those were very heavily kit-bashed items, including one of the most interesting baggage cars on the layout, and of course they're Pullman cars. The 38 freight cars I had on the layout, parts for these were, buying lumber from, your lumber dealers who had made, dimensional lumbers and flat wood. You also have parts from companies like Coronado and Grant Line that make castings, and these are absolutely crucial to being able to succeed at this. Plus, I had a Union Pacific pile driver and flat car. Now, these were a San Juan kit that I had, but since I was modeling the South Park and these were Rio Grande, it wasn't appropriate. But I was able to find a photograph of the pile driver the Union Pacific lent to the South Park in the late 1890s and was able to reproduce that using the parts from that particular kit. The layout operated with 10 On3 locomotives. 3 were from Overland of the Mason Bogie type, which were 2 6/6Ts. That means there's a 1 axle, 2 wheels in front, 6 drivers, 6 wheels under the tender, and the T means is all one unit. I explained earlier about the Mason Bogies. I had one LMB 286T Mason Bogie, and the last Mason I had was another 286T that was constructed from a kit, and I used the word kit in quotations, of South Park fine scale. That was a total disaster, but I was able to take each unit, rebuild it, redesign it, and came up with a very nice running model. Not for the faint at heart, but it was certainly doable. 2 other models I had on the layout were Sunset Rio Grande C16s that were originally delivered to the Rio Grande as Class N60 narrow gauge locomotives. Now they rechanged their numbers and classifications in 1923, so the N is narrow gauge and the 60 is the number they used to identify it. Actually, the wheelbase on the engines, though, conformed more correctly to the Class N56 engines, which were a little lighter and which were the types that were delivered to the South Park. Now, when it came down to these particular locomotives, I had to redo the tenders, all new tenders, new smokestacks, new cabs, new dome, new pilot. And this was a learning curve with engines that I started to work on, of stepping into the world of machining and learning how to actually build a locomotive. This was a long process of learning, and it was very rewarding because as a modeling Colorado Midland, I had to scratch built 11 locomotives, and I could not have done it unless I had worked on these South Park engines like this and learned various steps of how to build domes, how to cut the sides for the cabs, and etc. The other 3 engines I had were moguls. One was a rebuilt Bachmann, which it was a nightmare, and it took me a long time to overcome the problems with that. It was massively rebuilt, and it had all the electronics were placed in the tender because the engine had no space inside the boiler for any that works other than the motor. I also acquired a Balboa Cook mogul, which was too new for me, but I took the salt of that and cut the boiler and made a wagon top boiler out of it. And when I was all said and done, the only thing left of that engine that was original was actually the frame. All the rest of it was rebuilt. And again, I cringed when I had to take the saw to the boiler, but it was a learning curve and a very necessary step in my mental psychological development to be able to do this kind of work. The last engine I built is actually fully scratched. I built the South Park's #1 engine, the Fairplay, which has a very beautiful painting in the pictorial supplement showing the engine and in all its glory with its Russian down jacket and beautiful paint job of the early 1880s.
So when you say you modified Bachmann equipment, locomotives and cars, the Bachmann equipment is 30-inch gauge, or ON30, and so you had to widen those to 36-inch gauge, or ON 3 feet. Is that correct?
The modification process for the Bachmann equipment, in one case was very easy, in the other place I had a lot of trouble with it. The passenger cars were simply taking the axles, wheels out and putting in new ones. I didn't even have to change the side frames of the trucks. The engine, however, proved to be a bit of a problem. There are kits available that supposedly do this and can widen the drivers out an extra 6 inches, but for some reason or another, it didn't work for me. And to make a long story short, if it weren't for a lot of patience or whatever, the engine would have wound up against the wall, concrete wall. But I withheld my temper and frustration and ended up building a frame to sister onto the original frame that would hold the drivers in the proper place and put the axles through the frame. So there actually were 2 frames. The frame I made that sistered on the frame the Bachmann came with and actually gave me the 36-inch gauge that I was looking for. It was well worth. The engine ran very nicely, and I was always pleased to have it running, and it looked great, and have all the sound equipment with it, and a nice motor with it.
So now you're going to build the physical layout itself. Can you give us some of the details?
I would like to emphasize the rewards you have in designing the layout and constructing it, of putting these all together at the same time and work out the issues. It is time well spent and very rewarding to have a successful layout. I wanted the areas of the railroad portrayed I've already discussed, with the Platte Canyon and Como and Breckenridge. And I wanted a proper presentation when someone walks into the room. I wanted to feel like they're looking at Colorado, looking at the mountains. I feel that the model layout is an artistic exercise. It is like a painting or some type of other artistic activity that you're actually putting together a presentation to the visitor and trying to convey a particular feeling. And one of the things I wanted to make sure in the presentation that there was a huge amount of scenery in relation to the railroad itself. I wanted to be able to stand in the room in any one place and look out and see mountain range, ridge after ridge after ridge across the room to the other end of the side of the room and see the backdrop. And this required, some pre-planning and not having a spaghetti bowl type of a layout. You needed lots of area for the mountains to show for themselves. I wanted the scenery to play a co-equal part with the model railroad itself. And I always took the thing with the trains, less is more with the trains, and I wanted more scenery to have the trains look like they're actually going through the countryside instead of going through a small area, maybe about 6 inches deep. I had been building model railroads since the mid-50s, and back then, of course, it was plaster and screen wire and a little tacks and all kinds of cuts and mashed fingers putting in tacks. And I had tried other things, but I decided I like to go back to that again because one of the issues I could use is a staple gun and go back and attach the screen wire very easily with a staple gun instead of little tacks. I also didn't like the idea of the paper under the layout. I've had that one time, and I had problems with silverfish, and it was always a smelly issue with mold in the room. It's a basement layout, so therefore, if you don't keep it properly controlled environmentally, it begins to smell in there, and I didn't want any part of this. And I felt if I kept all things to natural materials, such as plaster, I would not have this in any particular problem. So I went back to that. I went back to the plaster and screen wire and was very happy with that. The rock castings on the layout, I made rubber molds from a metamorphic rock called quartzite, which represented Colorado's granite mountains quite well. I checked with my next door neighbor who was a geologist and examined the issues about how to miniaturize that, and she gave me advice that yes, that worked very well for that. So the quartzite molds were used for all the rock castings. As for the ground cover on the layout, back when I was a kid doing this, you paint the layout and drip on your True Life colored sawdust, and that was about it, and that was pretty bad. But in 1962, I was doing a Civil War diorama on the Battle of Fredericksburg. My father had done one on Sharpsburg, and then he used this stuff that's like oatmeal and never hardened, and I couldn't afford to buy it. And I finally dawned on me, why not use real dirt? So I went out to the backyard and dug up dirt, dried it, sifted it, and put it in the diorama, and I was very happy with it. And when it came down to do the South Park layout, I thought to myself, why not use the real dirt? Why not use all the facets that you get from natural dirt, all the coloration, the facets in the stone, all the fine gravel you get, the different colorations, gradations of the materials, which give you an infinite more complex vision to look at than the monotone of a manufactured product. And of course, you're also capturing the pure color of the area you're modeling. So I did some trips out to Colorado with my freezer bags and a trowel and brought the stuff back, sifted it, and used that on each of the locations I actually modeled. And I have been absolutely delighted with the results of that and have done that on my Midland layout. There are also the issues of pine trees and aspen trees on the layout. I know my father made a comment a long time ago, back in the 50s and 60s, Western railroads are easy to do because there's not much vegetation. Well, if you're doing white sands missile ground where it's all sand and dirt, that's fine. But if you're in the other parts, you have pine trees and aspens to deal with. And it has more independently be done. And I had to put approximately 800 pine trees plus hundreds of aspens on the layout. And one of the issues about how I could do the pine trees, I found a way using wire from the floral shop, hemp rope, and making my own. And I could make a pine tree, a 50-foot pine tree, in about 15 minutes with the spray and all the stuff. Now, I couldn't make, all day long, 8 hours a day, making pine trees, but each tree would only take about 15 minutes to make. And it would certainly added a lot of variation to the layout and really added a lot to replicating what you see in a Colorado scene.
Given your propensity for historical accuracy, I'll be willing to bet that a lot of your structures are scratch-built.
When one steps through the doorway of prototype modeling, unless you're modeling one of the most famous railroads, say Pennsylvania or Union Pacific, you are going to have to build your own buildings. Fortunately, there are lots of buildings, materials available. Grant Line makes all kinds of doors and castings, windows, stoves. There's lots of wood material available, and it's not particularly difficult to reconstruct buildings from 1882. You can also go to the historical societies and publications and see what these buildings look like and actually how large they were. A lot of the buildings can be compressed. If you look on the layout, the Hotel Deansbury is greatly compressed, but it did not lose the overall effectiveness of the building because I was able to retain the essence of the columns and the building itself. When it came to the buildings in Como, this was not compressible because an engine house is a certain size and you cannot reduce the size of the engine house other than removing stalls. And the engine house at Como is an iconic structure with 6 stone stalls, and I could not remove any of those, so that was not compressible. And the hotel, the Gilman House, and the station, since they were near the engine house, couldn't be compressed either. Building the Gilman House and some of the other buildings, when I began to use plexiglass for the interior of the buildings for stability, and greatly increased the stability of the building and also reduced the construction time greatly. When it came time to build the engine house at Boreas Pass, the interior of the structure itself is plexiglass and is covered with stone walls both inside and out. And as this thing was being built in 1882-83, I was able to show the building under construction and not finished. I had one person ask me, said, well, that was easier to do. And I said, no, because if I put a roof on the building, I wouldn't have to finish the interior, which I did in this. But it made a beautiful model and has shown up on a number of places besides this video.
Your layout was designed to operate. So can you tell us a little bit about your operational concept?
During the design phase of the layout, it became readily apparent that not every other area of the railroad would be of interest operationally. The topic traffic density and whatever would work in certain areas, but other areas would not. It would not have enough traffic to do it. The South Park operated on a timetable and had lots of extras during this period of 1882. He had plenty of construction trains and extra traffic on the railroad to add particular interest. So with that, and also with the division point at Como, I had trains going over the new route that would go to Leadville over Voorhees Pass into Breckenridge, or I could operate west to Gunnison or Leadville on the yellow line over the Rio Grande right away. One of the things that was interesting in this particular time is the engines did not have any assigned duties. You would not find a Pacific locomotive doing this particular job. That would come later, very much later. They all would have assigned duty, but my period, they did not. One of the nice things about an operation was to convert the thing from DCC, where I could use helpers and run trains in second sections, whereas with the old block system I put in originally, did not allow for that. Well, the old maxim is I could always follow the prototype, and as long as you understood the traffic on the prototype at the time, you were fairly safe. I also used the introduction of telegraph, a very simple, straightforward key system with cheat sheets for everybody, and it didn't matter whether you knew Morse or not, because phones and radios were not historically correct. The car card system is straightforward from like a Micromart 4-card system, and I just used one card at a time, and I could schedule the cars to go anywhere I wanted to and anytime I wanted them on the layout, which greatly enhanced the realism and the operation interest.
All this planning, all this work, all this building, did the layout eventually meet your expectations?
When I had the layout somewhat along, I would say maybe about 3/4 built, I decided to have an operating session to see how this worked and learn what the people had to think about it, if the thing actually functioned the way it's supposed to. And it was an absolute delight. I can't tell you the thrill I had. It fulfilled all my dreams to see this thing operated. It actually made history come alive for me, to see this railroad actually doing something as I would envision the prototype to do. It was beyond my wildest expectations that this worked the way it did, and I felt the way I did about the railroad.
Your magnificent South Park Railroad is no more. Why did you move on?
My introduction to the South Park began 52 years ago, dreaming, designing, building, operating, having fun. But after that many years, 52 years of this, it sort of became a little stale. I was hoping it would last a lifetime, but unfortunately, I had another message in mind, and it was time to move on. I realized that either I was going to be leaving the hobby, or I was going to have to do something else. And I found it no longer an outlet for my creative needs or my problem-solving needs, which I enjoy very much as part of the hobby. And I decided it was, now or never to do something else. And so I decided to close the book on the South Park and move on to another love I had. My father introduced me in 1965 with the publication of the Colorado Midland book by Morris Kafke. And that's where I am right now in the Colorado Midland, which is probably going to be my last major layout I'll build. Age and whatever else catch up with you. But I expect the same from that. And I look for many years of enjoyment modeling the Midland.
As mentioned earlier in the narration, the South Park layout has been replaced. Andy now models the 19th century standard gauge Colorado Midland in O scale to Proto 48 standards with the correct gauge, shallow flanges, and narrow tires. His new layout is marked by hand-laid rail and scratch-built loco structures and rolling stock. The South Park video was shot by a couple of college students. At Andy's request, I re-edited the source video to reorder the scenes to follow the towns in sequence. Then we recorded and added this narration track. I have left the original author's credits in place at the end of the video. This is Terry Terrence. Thanks for watching.